This is a conversation with Eliot Cohen. Eliot is a military historian, a dean at the School of Advanced International Studies at John Hopkins University, a former official at the U.S. Department of State, and one of the most influential thinkers shaping U.S. foreign policy in recent decades. But in this interview, we talk about one specific topic. Why did most analysts and experts completely fail to predict how the war in Ukraine would turn out following Russia's invasion? Eliot recently published an extremely interesting paper dedicated to this very issue, co-authored with Professor Phillips O'Brien, and so we dove deep into it. We talked about why most experts wildly overestimated Russia's military capability and underestimated Ukraine's resilience and readiness. Why do we tend to either over or underestimate Russia? Whether the invasion could have actually turned out differently, or what do most analysts still keep getting wrong today? The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And it's also supported by generous patrons that you can join to help me make this sustainable, and also get access to various perks, including full ad-free episodes or the option to ask questions to my future guests. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you.
So I want to talk about the report that you co-wrote with Professor O'Brien and all the details that you're talking about in it. But first, to those listeners who didn't read the report, even though I would recommend for everyone to read it because it's really interesting, could you sort of summarize the context and what made you write it and the main conclusions that you reached and that you wrote about in the report?
Sure. So the origins of the report were when Phillips O'Brien, who's a professor of history at St. Andrews University in Scotland, and I were corresponding. We've known each other for some time. And quite early on in the after the full-scale invasion, we agreed that actually the Russians were doing very poorly and and the Ukrainians doing remarkably well. And we were more and more baffled, I think, by those assessments which said it was just going to be the opposite. And that led us to try to explore more deeply why was it that before the full-scale invasion, the assessments of the Russian military were wildly off in terms of what its real capabilities were. The Ukrainians were dramatically underestimated, and the predictions of what the course of the war were going to be like were so, again, wildly off. Now, we're both military historians. We both understand that in advance of a war, nobody gets it right. And, I've also been a senior official in the U.S. government, so I have some idea of what some of the uncertainties are there as well. But what struck us here was first the degree of certainty that people who turned out to be wrong had. That was one important thing. Secondly, the unanimity. There was really no dissent. And the third thing, we drew entirely on unclassified sources, but there's enough public evidence and plus private conversations on my part to make it clear that these were mistakes that were made within the American intelligence community as well. As I'm sure everybody knows, we did a very good job of predicting that the invasion would occur and a terrible job of predicting how it would play out. So we, the two of us got together. We plunged very deeply into the subject, did a lot of reading, put together a big database, and we had several conferences which were sponsored by the American Department of Defense, which also was interested in this. And I think there were a number of big conclusions. One really begins with the sociology of the analytic community here. That the analysis was driven by a very small group of people who consider themselves and regarded as Russia military analysts, quite a narrow specialty, not experts in military history, not Ukraine experts, not Russian historians, but having this very narrow expertise. And that, I think, made them much more vulnerable to groupthink and to a common view. Secondly, a, a tremendous overemphasis on some of the quantifiable aspects of war at the expense of the unquantifiable. So there's a lot of focus on how many tanks do the Russians have and so forth. Very little on things like corruption or morale or what's the impact of them not having a real non-commissioned officer corps. Um, I think another dimension of the failure had to do with a tendency to mirror image, to assume that the Russians could do on a lesser scale the kinds of things the United States did vis-a-vis Iraq in 2003 and before that in 1991. And I think we also found that a lot of the analysts essentially, consciously or not, adopted the Russian understanding of Ukraine as kind of a phony state that didn't have a real national identity, a state at least half of whose people would be perfectly happy being part of Russia, a state that was corrupt, although why it should be considered any more corrupt than Russia is a mystery, a state whose military preparations had not really advanced at all since the beginning of the war in 2014. Now, all these turned out to be completely incorrect. The thing that in some ways is most alarming about this is the extent to which, as I said, there was no dissent within that community. There were career incentives, I think, not to disagree with one another, and it hasn't really changed. And it had a real impact on policy, particularly in the case of the United States, the willingness to supply Ukraine with advanced weaponry and to do so at scale and with a real sense of urgency. So that's there's more that I can say, but in a nutshell, that's it.
I want to talk more about the details of what you've mentioned, but first, what I find interesting is that you focus on the failure in analyzing how the invasion would go, not really on the analysis of or the failure of the analysis of whether the invasion would happen. And you say in the report that that was not really a surprise because the U.S. intelligence agencies were talking about it months in advance, and they had that right, as you mentioned. But I think it's still quite interesting because many respected analysts and Russia experts, I think especially in Europe, maybe more so than in the US, publicly doubted that it would happen, that Russia would conduct the invasion, despite the US intelligence that was out there. And I wonder if that wasn't also a massive analytical failure that would deserve a closer study. And if you think that maybe these two failures are connected or related in some sense.
Well, I'm an American, of course, and so I'm obviously thinking more about the American intelligence community than the European ones. I mean, it's quite what you say is quite true. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which took place, I think, 2 days before the full scale invasion, and I had exactly the experience you described of talking to European colleagues who really said either this isn't going to happen, it's a bluff, or that Putin would just take a sort of a chunk of Ukraine, but not all of it. So let me explain, as far as I can, what I think the American success was and why the others misunderstood the likelihood of it happening. One area, first, the American intelligence community is huge, and despite what one sometimes hears, it's actually very competent. What it has been focused on for many, many years is what's sometimes called indications and warning intelligence. And that's completely understandable because really the current American intelligence community originates in Pearl Harbor or after the Pearl Harbor attack, the failure to give warning of that massive attack. And that is frequently how we frame analysis and analytic failure. When people talk about 9/11, they also talk about the same thing, indications and warning. So that is something we're very focused on, we're very good at. And it is something that is easy to detect if you have advanced technical means, which we do. I was when I was in the Army as a reserve officer, I was a military intelligence officer, and I remember learning the long lists of things that a large then Soviet military unit would have to do in order to get ready to move, where it would put forward ammunition dumps, where you'd put hospitals. There's a myriad of things that military organizations need to do before they launch an attack, activating communications networks. These are all, I think, quite well known, and we were able to monitor that. And so I think that that intelligence problem played to American strengths, and it isn't in any case difficult to conceal. For the Europeans, I think there were a couple of things that worked. First, the long shadow of the American intelligence failure in Iraq, the failure to the belief that there was an active nuclear program in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and there wasn't, made Europeans, particularly I think bureaucrats and officials, maybe not intelligence officers so much, is doubtful about the quality of American intelligence. So that was one thing. But the deeper problems are first wishful thinking. In many ways, Europe's been living in a dreamland since the end of the Cold War, not wanting to believe that Russia is what it is and Putin is who he is. So there's just this is something human beings are prone to, the belief that the things that we want to believe really are true. There's certainly that. But there's another thing as well, and that is a reluctance to come to grips with what Putin's real ambitions were. I mean, I think there were plenty of people who didn't think of him as a nice guy, but thought of him as a reasonable, rational, calculating kind of guy. And so they ignored the most important evidence, which was right out in front of them, which is this rather kooky essay that he wrote on the historical unity of Russian and Ukrainian people. It just seemed too ludicrous to believe. Now, unfortunately, there are plenty of 20th century parallels for reasonable, liberal, democratic Europeans to look at a dictator and say, well, he can't actually mean that. He has to be much more reasonable. That's just cover. That's just language. But the truth is he meant it. And we should have known that he meant it. And we didn't want to believe that he meant it. So I think that really ended up crippling the European ability to judge correctly. Now, there are exceptions to that. I think some of the Baltic states, particularly the Estonians, who I think have an excellent intelligence service, some of the Nordic states, like Finland, had a much better take. But I think particularly the West Europeans, and I would say particularly the Germans and the French, chose not to believe what they didn't want to believe.
Yeah, I definitely think that the wishful thinking part of it is quite correct. And maybe Europe needed its own 9/11 or Pearl Harbor type of an intelligence failure to kind of wake up to this reality. But if I go back to your report and the failure that you were studying, you've already hinted at it, but in the report you mentioned that we hugely underestimated Ukrainian capabilities and overestimated Russian ones. What were the specific aspects, if you can elaborate on it a little bit more, on both the Russian side and the Ukrainian ones that you think most people got wrong and that ended up playing the biggest difference?
So on the Russian side, first, simply sins of omission. That is failure to think through what the pervasive corruption of the Russian system, in which vast sums of money go astray, in which people steal military hardware and sell it, what that would mean for what the Russian military was capable of. And I think you really saw that as kind of logistics broke down. early on because, people had sold truck tires and replaced them with much cheaper substitutes and, sold the originals, that sort of thing. That's one big thing. Second thing is, intelligence analysts are intellectuals of a kind, and intellectuals are prone to the fallacious view that ideas matter more than they do. And what happened in this case, part of what happened in this case, is people were entranced by the subtlety and complexity of Russian military doctrine, which is very well developed, always has been, but ignoring two fundamental things. One is, can they actually execute the things that they say they want to be able to do? And of course, we actually know that their exercises are completely scripted. And so it's not like the free play exercises that, say, our military or the Israeli military engages in. But the other thing is, nobody really asked, well, does this actually make sense? And I mean, it seemed almost wrong to question the sophistication of Russian military thought. In this particular case, one of the things that the Russians have done is they had shifted their organization to something called battalion tactical groups. So the actual origins of this is the desire not to send conscripts to fight foreign wars, so they wanted to rely more on contract soldiers. What that created were two big problems for them. So what they would do is they would take an infantry battalion, give it some armor, give it some artillery, but basically they would be pretty short of infantry. And the Russians really paid a penalty for that when they advanced into closed terrain where they didn't have the infantry that could spread out and kind of clear ambush sites and so on. So they ended up being very roadbound, very vulnerable to ambushes and that sort of thing. The second, even bigger problem is they had a span of control problem. If you create scores and scores of battalion tactical groups, but you don't focus command at the brigade level, several battalions forming a brigade, or the division level, several brigades forming a division, you're just going to find all this very, very hard to control. And so it proved. Another failure along these lines was, and again, this I think goes to the question of mirror imaging, a view that, well, the Russian army is now a professional army because they have volunteers, the so-called contract soldiers. Well, actually, those were, for the most part, conscripts who had signed up for another year, in some cases even been coerced to signing up for another year. It's not a professional military in the way that the American military is, or say the British military is. It's a completely different kind of beast, and we just didn't process it. I think one other big mistake that people made, and some of this just gets down to the sloppy use of language, is talking about the Russian military as a combat-tested military, which it was not. So there were a lot of references to Russian military experience in Syria. Well, in Syria, their main military experience was bombing civilians. It wasn't ground combat, certainly not ground combat against, a peer adversary who was really determined to fight. It was, as I said, mainly bombing civilians. That's not combat experience. And so it was much less of a hardened military machine than people think. And then, of course, there's the underestimation of the Ukrainians, which is also a critical part of the story.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And now, back to the conversation. Do you think, when you talk about the lack of combat experience, do you think that the Russian experiences from Chechnya or even the years of fighting in Ukraine prior to the major invasion, do you think that wasn't applicable or that didn't prove to be as important?
Not as much. So first in Chechnya, I mean, look, there are always some units which are experienced and more professional. I mean, their paratroop units probably be the best example. But remember, in those cases, first in Chechnya, The way the Russians resolved that was, as they've tried in Ukraine, a massive application of firepower, destroying the city of Grozny and then kind of marching in to clean up, together with playing on internal feuds in Chechnya, buying off, one character or another, and ruling through intermediaries. And to extent you have that now, of course, with Ramzan Kadyrov, who's basically a local warlord. Well, there are no, I think they would have liked to split Ukraine, but it turned out that they couldn't. Their proxies were not available, and they've tried the high firepower approach, but Chechnya is a really small place, and Ukraine is a really big place. Again, one of the things that's so striking about the Russia military analysts is if you look at me, and a number of them would not let us use the maps that they put on television or in articles for a very good reason, because those maps had arrows, going every which way, getting all the way to the Polish border. It's what a military friend of mine once called the big hand, small map problem. That, these things are very easy if you're just drawing lines on a small map. But Ukraine, of course, is larger than France. It's a big country. And you cannot really compare fighting war in a very tiny, compressed space, except at the purely tactical level, with fighting war in a huge space. And they were trying some very ambitious maneuvers over a very large space against an enemy who was really determined to resist.
I think one of another aspects, now that we're talking about it, is that you're talking about the failure of the Western analysis of Russian military and Ukrainian military strength. But it sounds to me like you could basically apply the same thing and say the same thing about the same failure of Russian military analysis of their own capabilities and Ukrainian.
Of course. I mean, we're unfortunately at a juncture in history where people have their doubts about democratic governments and what they're capable of. And I think you tend to forget that a autocratic system like the Russian or the Chinese has to be built on lies. You have to keep the top man happy. Now that happens in any government. In any government, there is, and I've seen this firsthand when I was counselor of the State Department. There is a tendency to shade the truth that the person on top gets. But democracy has some built-in correctives to that. There's political competition for office, but there's also a more open intellectual culture, and you have decision makers sometimes. And I was fortunate to have one in Condoleezza Rice, who point really do welcome having somebody who will give them a different point of view. I don't think any of that held true in this case, and I think you really see that in that kind of famous and sort of spooky meeting that Putin has with all of his subordinates, saying, "Are you in favor of the war?" And when I think it was Sergei Narishkin hesitated a little bit, Putin kind of slapped him around verbally. So bad news. That's a system in which bad news does not get up to the top, and you repeatedly saw that during the more active phase of the war. When the Russians would just launch these repeated assaults that made zero sense, that caused them huge casualties. And it was pretty clearly because people are not willing to tell their superiors this isn't working and can't work.
You mentioned the consequences of this analytical failure in terms of policies and then impact on the war. How do you think that things would have looked now? How different would have things were if largely the analysis would be more correct and there would be less of an certainty that Ukraine is bound to fall in a few days?
I think what would have happened is very early on, you would have seen us first, moving fairly advanced weapons in there as soon as possible in quantity, things like HIMARS, our mobile rocket systems, or I mean, we even hesitated about giving them modern field howitzers. I think, secondly, you would have seen behind that a desire to begin quite early on programs which might not bear fruit for a year or two. So, M1 tanks, F-16s, things of that kind. I think you also would have seen much less inhibition about allowing them to strike targets inside Russia with Western hardware. I think the upshot of all that is there was a moment, particularly towards the end of 2022, when the Ukrainians were on a roll and the Russians were really on the back foot. And that moment was lost. And I think that was a moment in which I don't know that the Ukrainians could have recovered all their lost territory, but they might have recovered a lot more, probably including at least the approaches to Crimea, if not all of Crimea itself, and inflicted such shocking blows on Russia that Russia might have been willing to deal. As it was, because the aid trickled in, because we didn't do things like put in military aid missions into Ukraine, the front stabilized. And this very day, we seem to want to prevent the Ukrainians from losing, but we can't make our minds to say we want them to win.
You focus on the problem with underestimating Russian military capabilities, which was definitely true prior to the invasion and in the beginning of the invasion. But overestimating, sorry, yes, overestimating. But I feel that at some point, and I think it changes throughout the war, it's on and off, but there was definitely a point where Russian military turned out to be less competent than we thought. And then there was sort of an overcorrection from many analysts, where it almost went from Russia being seen as this almighty military superpower to just like a bunch of incompetent, blubbling idiots. But that's also not true, and that's also not a correct analysis. And that could be even more dangerous because it's probably better to overestimate your opponent than to underestimate him. I wonder if you would agree that there maybe is a risk of going from one extreme to the other.
To some extent, but the error has been so far over on one side that it's some quite a considerable correction is called for. I think as we look at the Russians, I think what the things that do stand out is first the Russians willing to take much heavier losses than I think most of us would have anticipated. A certain amount of operational level adaptation, that is to say, um, things like the Surovikin line and developing a concept of operations which uh, played to their complete ruthlessness about taking casualties, and then some really pretty minor tactical adaptations. I mean, the Russian military is not this. This has been a pretty poor performance. It is a pretty second-rate military, which has not really shown itself capable of maneuver down to the present day. I mean, what they can do is they can throw a lot of people and a lot of machines and a lot of artillery shells repeatedly against an undermanned Ukrainian front line. That's not impressive at all. I mean, it remains a second-rate military. It does not have infinite resources. I think the danger is you can talk yourself into thinking that you're up against the Red Army in World War II, and you're really not. I mean, that, by the way, was another source of error, is the kind of mental image that we have of the Soviets, of the Russians, as being the second coming of the Soviets, and they're not. I mean, it's a very different country than it was in 1943 or 44. Um, so I think actually we still tend to overestimate them. I mean, the problem is the Ukrainians have their own problems. It's a country, with not even a quarter of the population of Russia, which is now armed with a real kind of menagerie of different kinds of weapon systems. And one of the mistakes that we made was advising them to try to fight the war the way we would have fought it. And that's why their counteroffensive petered out the way that it did in 23. I mean, we should not, we tried to get them to fight our way, and that was a big mistake. But I'm not sure that I entirely agree with the idea that it's, the Russians have. Well, I know I don't agree with the idea that the Russians have recovered. They really have not. They you don't recover from losing um, officers with 15, 20 years experience quickly. And though I'm sure in some ways they are better, but on the whole, if they were up against, say, the American military, which is a first-rate military, they'd be defeated very quickly, I think.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now back to the conversation. Do you think that in general, in the analytical community at large, still at this point tends to overestimate the Russians then, or is it more or less accurate?
I think, one of the things that's a bit disheartening is both in terms of the reaction to the report, but even when we were working on it, we tried to invite some of these people to come to some of the conferences we ran. Most of them didn't want to engage at all, um, or were just incredibly defensive. And they've been allowed to get away with it. I mean, one of the things that does strike you is, or struck me, it struck Phil, is, if you look at who some of the people who get not only, interviewed on TV or quoted in the New York Times or something, but even invited to the White House, it's the same people. And you just don't have the feeling anybody's sort of keeping score and saying, well, wait a second, you were so profoundly wrong about the beginning of the war. How can I be sure that you're not wrong now? And there's been very little soul searching. And I think a large part of this is because of our media culture. We have quite a superficial media culture which is driven by, and I've seen this firsthand, producers at something like CNN or BBC who don't actually know anything about the subject that you're asking somebody to talk on. They want a name that they've heard of. If there's somebody in the Rolodex, they'll keep on calling them. And they're not going to devote 10 minutes to finding out, well, does this person actually know what they're talking about? And have they been right in the past or wrong in the past? And none of that. So there's no kind of vetting or simply holding people accountable or simply getting them to engage with the mistakes that they've made.
I also from experience couldn't agree more about the media observation. One thing that I wanted to follow up on was the um, mistake with mistaking or seeing the Russian military as similar force as the Soviet military. And I feel like that's at least in part because of falling victim to Russian propaganda, because that's one of the ways, that's one of the messages that Russia likes to put out there to conjure up the image that Russian military is, this unstoppable machine in the same sense as we tend to see the Soviet army in the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, even there, people fail to realize sometimes that the Russian military could only function as it did because it was, they were getting vast quantities of supplies from the United States, trucks, locomotives, all kinds of other things. But still, the Soviet Union during World War II was a much more formidable machine, um, including in sheer size. They lost over 1 million men in the opening campaigns of the war, but they had millions more already under arms. And the Russians go into this war with an army of like maybe 300,000, 400,000, depending on what you're counting, an order of magnitude smaller, and an industry which is much more problematic. In World War II, arguably the Russians had the best tank, the T-34. Nothing comparable here. Uh, and in fact, actually, if you look across the range of weapon systems, the Russian systems just aren't all that good. They really aren't, and that's not what the situation was during World War II. And it was, above all, I would say, not nearly as corrupt a system as it is now. I mean, just look at the number of generals with their hands in the till. I mean, whatever else you think about generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky and Konev and many others, they weren't in it simply to, make money by selling stuff.
One thing that I wanted to raise, and I think maybe you'll disagree with me, but that's fine. But I want to play the devil's advocate for a little bit. I think that the criticism that you make in the report is completely fair, and I agree with it. But one thing that I would argue is that maybe in the same way that before the invasion, most people saw Ukraine fall as inevitable, I think today, when people look back, they tend to see the fact that Ukraine was certain to survive as inevitable as well. But I feel like that's not really true either. And if a few things happened differently, for example, if Zelensky would have left the country instead of staying there, if the Hostomel airport operation would have was planned differently, if the whole invasion was planned better, um, then the whole outcome could have been different. Um, I wonder if you would agree with that, and if you sort of took that in account when you were writing the report.
Well, in fact, if you look at one of the chapters of the report, you'll see we deal with that with that set of arguments. One of the things I do is we do is invoke a text by Philip Tetlock, who's a very prominent psychologist who wrote a book called Expert Political Judgment, and it's a book about why the experts, particularly in the world of political science, who are make predictions, often do worse than the proverbial monkey throwing darts at a dartboard. I mean, they do worse than 50-50. And what he then does, it's a fascinating book. It's really worth reading, and quite relevant to this topic. But one of the things he talks about is what are the excuses that experts make in retrospect to justify themselves? And one of them is, it very nearly could have gone the other way. And most of those arguments fall apart, like the Hostomel airport. First, was it a coincidence that they landed on top of a Ukrainian mechanized unit? I'm not so sure. Secondly, suppose they had taken Hostomel, fine. This airport right outside Kiev. And suppose they dropped in a bunch of paratroopers. You then drive into a huge city filled with armed people who want to kill you. And if there's one thing that we know, it's urban warfare is extraordinarily manpower and firepower intensive. And there's no particular reason to think they would have been able to fight their way through Kiev with however many paratroopers they dropped in. Of course, if Zelensky had fled, maybe it would have been something. It would have been different if Vladimir Putin had dropped dead of a heart attack. You can't do your counterfactuals all in one direction. Nothing is inevitable. Nothing's inevitable. But the kind of guy that Zelensky clearly was not the kind of guy who was going to flee. Moreover, a lot of the big preparations that were made by General Zaluzhny and others, those were all in place, and there is plenty of evidence that the mood in Ukraine, throughout Ukraine, was one of being quite willing to fight. So as I said, nothing is inevitable. Things can always go differently. There can always be accidents. But I think these, well, we were nearly right arguments turn out to be actually fallacious. They really are. A similar one is, well, suppose Zelensky had been killed. Well, they tried to kill him. They made several attempts. They sent in various Spetsnaz groups to try to get him. I'm sure if they knew where he was, they would have dropped a bomb on him. There's a reason why they weren't able to do it. He was actually very well protected, and so on. So I think um, those excuses let people off the hook too easily.
There's a review of your report by Lawrence Friedman. I assume that you're familiar with it, which I think is a uh, quite a compliment when someone like Lawrence Friedman writes a review of your report already. But one of the arguments that he's making is that basically wars and conflicts are just inherently unpredictable, and that there will always be failures in analyzing their outcomes because there's just so many variables. Do you think that maybe it is sort of something that it's almost impossible to predict because you never know how effective militaries will be until they're actually used in a conflict?
Well, of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. As we document in this report, what's striking is there was no uncertainty, none, in any of the predictions, none. If that had been if they'd been qualified saying we think this is likely, I think it would be different. But that's not what this was. This was absolute, rock solid certainty, and that certainty permeated government, and it had consequences. And that leads me to the second point, which is, if you take that argument and say, well, it's all completely unpredictable, and by the way, Tetlock talks about this. It's the future is cloud-like thing, so you can't hold me accountable for anything I say. That's intellectually irresponsible. If you can't be held accountable for anything that you say is going to happen, then it means that the whole enterprise is pointless. Then every statement that you make can be fantasy, and if it turns out to be completely incorrect, then well, things are always incorrect. I don't buy that at all. I think, look, this report was very unsettling. I know Laurie Friedman; he is a friend of mine. I will say, however, this report was very unsettling for a lot of people who depended on these Russian military analysts. And that's something to remember. It's not just them; it's all the people who depend on them.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, and it's a fair argument. One more thing that I was thinking about when reading the report is that I noticed a lot of similar analytical failures in many other areas related to the war, but a lot of them was where we underestimated Russia rather than overestimated them, that were also consequential. For example, we underestimated how resilient the Russian economy would be. We overestimated overestimated how the Russian public would react to the war, and we thought that they would reject it a lot more than they did. I know that this is not something that you've studied and that it's not necessarily your expertise, but do you see a similarity between these different failures in different areas of studying Russia and what you wrote? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.